Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Media Mayhem. I'm really thrilled to welcome back Rick Alan Ross, who's an expert on cults. He's the executive director of the Cult Education Institute and author of the new book, Cults Inside Out, How People Get In and Can Get Out. Today, we're going to be discussing something that's been really in the news, and that's death cults, and what makes people join them, and is it possible to get people out once they've decided to become part of cults like ISIS or other death cults. We're also going to be discussing whether mainstream society helps to create cults like ISIS. Are there things we do to push people towards these type of cults, and are there things we can do to keep them out of these types of cults? So I want to welcome you, Rick, to the show. Thanks so much for coming back and being with us today.
Hi, Allison. It's good to be back.
So my first question is, and I know it's a question that everyone at home is probably asking themselves, but what are we talking about when we're talking about the terminology death cults?
Well, we're talking about, I would say, the most destructive cults in the world today. We're talking about groups that are intensely violent, that kill people, that engage in criminal activity. We've seen this on a smaller scale historically. There was a group in the 1980s led by Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh that committed the first act of terrorism on United States soil, bioterrorism, when they poisoned hundreds of people in Antelope, Oregon, in order to prevent them from voting in an election. We saw it again in the 90s with a group called Shinrikyo in Japan. That was the group led by Shoko Asahara that released sarin gas, poison gas, on the Tokyo subway system, sending thousands of people to the hospitals of Tokyo and killing many immediately. Asahara is now waiting to be executed in Japan in prison. So we've seen these kind of groups on a smaller scale in the past where they violently have struck out. We've seen very morose, morbid groups focused on doomsday or the apocalypse, and we've called them doomsday cults or apocalyptic cults. And they are the same as other destructive cults, but they're much more intensely destructive and much more lethal. And now what we see is a group in the Middle East, ISIS or Daesh, that is of the most extreme nature, killing thousands and thousands of people. What they all have in common is an absolute authoritarian leader that becomes the defining element of the group and virtually like an object of worship. And then there is a process at work, often called thought reform or brainwashing, where people are broken down, changed, and then frozen in a new kind of pseudo-personality. And then finally, the level of destruction that the group does that defines it as a destructive cult. We can see these characteristics in ISIS, in Al-Qaeda, in Boko Haram, and other groups who all had charismatic leaders with idiosyncratic theology and beliefs, and who had absolute power over their followers.
Well, then how, if you say kill one of the leaders, which we've done over and over again, and we just saw happen in Paris with the French police going right after, actually in a very effective manner, to the person who masterminded the terror attacks of the November 13th. So if we kill one of those leaders, how does that affect the makeup of the cult?
It greatly affects it. I mean, what we've seen since the death of Osama bin Laden is the deterioration of Al-Qaeda. And the drone strikes that have taken out other leaders in Al-Qaeda have had a similar effect. In the case of ISIS, you have a leader who calls himself a caliph, al-Baghdadi, Bakur al-Baghdadi, who is the mind behind ISIS and its idiosyncratic belief system. I mean, he is the one that has kind of put together this composite belief system about the restoration of a caliphate in the Middle East, and himself as the grand caliph, in much the same way that Osama bin Laden masterminded Al-Qaeda, much to the chagrin of the Saudis and other Muslims who really saw him as an aberrational leader, someone that they did not share beliefs with, who was very much separate and apart from them. Another thing that's really fascinating is to see the hatred that is between the group ISIS and the group Al-Qaeda. And it really brings into focus the fact that these are two totalitarian absolutist groups that not only are intolerant of any other frame of reference in terms of the Western world or Western culture, but they are intolerant of other Muslims and even intolerant of other extremist groups that act in the name of Islam. So these are very exclusive groups, very authoritarian groups controlled by totalitarian dictators, essentially.
Now, I had on a guest yesterday who talked a bit about the differences between the Charlie Hebdo attacks and the simultaneous Paris attacks of November 13th. And he actually spoke a bit about how Al-Qaeda, which was responsible for the Charlie Hebdo, or took responsibility for the Charlie Hebdo attacks, did not kill the woman that was there, that they were after the cartoonists and the journalist who had participated in the magazine. So I'm curious, is there a difference if it's a death cult? They may not like each other and they don't respect each other, but is there a difference there in terms of their philosophical makeup?
It appears that al-Baghdadi is even more extreme than Osama bin Laden. I mean, we've seen that through the incredible atrocities that have been committed. Though there is kind of a parallel to some extent with the Taliban in Afghanistan. If you recall, the Taliban, also a very bizarre sect with Mullah Omar as its absolute leader, who we now know is dead. They destroyed the great Buddhas of Afghanistan in much the same way that ISIS is now destroying the historical artifacts of the Middle East. In particular, we're watching them destroy, Assyrian archaeological artifacts and the remains of a city in Syria. So, in this sense, they're similar. That is, that they see the world in terms of black and white. They are the conveyors of the truth, the conduit for the truth, and the world must be reordered according to their sacred truth and according to their leader. And it's a very much a cult mentality. And I think that's why President Obama has described ISIS as an apocalyptic cult, as well as Prime Minister Cameron, who called them a doomsday cult. And most recently, the French security expert Alain Bauer said to understand what they do, why they do it, how they do it, you have to see them as a destructive cult or sect, as the French would describe them.
Do you think that these world leaders are have been too slow to come to these conclusions? And did you see the ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other groups, Boko Haram, as cults long before we started to hear our president speak of ISIS as a cult? The language that was used was very careful for a very long time, and there seems to have been a change. But I'm curious, what has been your perspective on the changing in the way these different world leaders refer to ISIS?
Well, I think there has been an evolution. I began archiving information for the database of the Cult Education Institute about Al-Qaeda going back more than a decade. Also archiving information about Boko Haram and ISIS more recently. So I really felt, based on the way these groups are structured, the way they're led, the way they behave, their dynamics, that I was looking at destructive cults, not unlike, as I pointed out earlier, Shinrikyo or the followers of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. In the same way that Charles Manson, on a very small scale, could program people to kill for him, the leader of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, and the leader of al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, could do the same. I mean, they could basically break people down, reshape them, remold their thinking, create a mindset of death and destruction, in this sense, the death cult mindset, and then deploy them as essentially pawns in a scheme of murder, of destruction. And that's why Charles Manson is in prison, quite frankly, because he was convicted not because he was physically present for the murders in California, the Tate LaBianca murders, but because he masterminded and controlled the people that physically did his bidding, and therefore he was guilty of murder. And on a much grander scale is what we're seeing with ISIS and al-Baghdadi right now. And to understand that mindset, we need to understand the dynamics of destructive cults and how they work.
Well, I have a question about the destruction of historical property, such as the Assyrian ruins that were still present in Syria, and also destruction of ancient ruins in Iraq. I'm curious what exactly they are attempting to accomplish. I mean, these cults have been described as almost medieval, and a lot of what they ascribe to are things that we have seen historically in the Middle Ages and before the Middle Ages, in terms of the multiple marriages, the treatment of women. I mean, so many things are steps backwards, but I'm not sure that I understand how the eradication of historical monuments and artifacts plays into the death cult.
Well, the way it plays in, Allison, is like this. It is basically the reordering of the world according to the worldview of the leader. And in a book called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, Robert J. Lifton calls this a kind of the sacred science of the group, that they have a worldview and that view must be implemented everywhere that the group exists, that the group must impose its mindset, its view of the world on everything. And so, if you will, ISIS is reordering human history according to its own ideology. It's imposing its will, its leader's will, on the world. And that which the leader says is sacred, and that which the leader says is profane, and everything is determined on that paradigm. And so in this sense, we can see this isn't the clash of civilizations. This isn't even about Islam or the what to Muslims would be considered a legitimate expression of their religion, because as we know, these objects of antiquity existed in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan for centuries. I mean, the Muslims in Egypt are not tearing down the pyramids,
right,
are not defacing the temple of Karnak at Luxor. So what we're dealing with here is unique, it's different, and in order for us to understand it, in order for us to get our heads around it, we need to look at it from that perspective.
Well, there's another thing that is interesting to me, and that is the issue, and I'm sure that you at home, many of the viewers at home are wondering this. If you are able to take a hold of a person, to break them down, and then to turn them into a killing machine, how is it possible that the leaders of ISIS can do this with people that are living in the United States or even living in France? I mean, people that haven't traveled to Syria, haven't been trained, and merely have access to the internet. How do you engage in that type of thought control and that type of reshaping when you don't have the physical person there?
Well, Allison, I've been archiving material in the Cult Education Institute database in the subsection about ISIS to offer people examples of exactly how this is being done. And I've also talked about it in my book, Cults Inside Out. And basically, what we're living in is a time when you can actually create a cult through technology. I mean, with the social media, with Skype, with the web, with smartphones, with all the communication devices that we now have, it is possible to reach anyone, anywhere, and to recruit them. And in the same way that destructive cults recruit, which is by deception. I would call it bait and switch.
Right.
You tell somebody this is what you're all about. This is what you're doing. There's a romantic jihadi man who would like to meet you. There are humanitarian things that are being done. Just come to be with us. Come and experience us. Talk to us through Skype. Communicate with us through text messaging. Email with us. Become a part of our network. And if you will, embed yourself within the bubble that we have constructed, in which you begin to eliminate all other accurate feedback, and to the point that you become consumed within our bubble. You hear no other voices. You see no other faces. You know, I've talked to families where young people are being recruited by a cult through the social media, and the family will say, well, you know, my son or my daughter or my spouse, they close the door to that bedroom or that office, and they're there for hours on end. They're texting feverishly on their phone over and over again, communicating every 10, 15 minutes with someone via text. So it is possible, with the technology that exists today, to deceptively recruit people utilizing the social media, the web, and all the devices at our disposal. And then you pull them by the hundreds from the U.S., by the thousands apparently from other countries, into Syria, into Iraq, through Turkey, or wherever. And then once within that world that ISIS completely controls, that milieu, that bubble that they have completely engineered in Raqqa and in their camps, the person can then be even more completely influenced through coercive persuasion and influence.
But you could set them off to kill without having to have them travel. That's the thing that is interesting, not the only thing, but is intriguing, is that through this social media, through the technology, you could turn someone into a killer by leaving them in their own home. I mean, we're seeing homegrown terrorists in our own country, certainly abroad, who have contact in some way. Perhaps they've traveled at some point, but some have not even.
Well, we're seeing some being radicalized through the social media, through the web, through electronic devices without face-to-face contact. What we're also seeing a bit more, I think, in particular, the Europeans are seeing more, are people that are being pulled in and recruited through social media and through the web and such, and then they are coming into the training camps and then returning to the country that they came from and then committing terrorist acts and then venting their newfound radicalization. But I think you've hit on something, which is, yes, people are being radicalized without having face-to-face contact. That you can create, and I've seen this through other groups, other destructive cults that I've examined, that you can actually, Allison, have a group where people do not meet, where they communicate via Skype, where they communicate via the web, where they transfer money through PayPal to the group or whatever means, through a bank transfer. Everything can be handled without face-to-face contact, without actually meeting the other person. I actually did an intervention to get a young woman in Canada out of a cult where she had never met the leader, who was in Nebraska. And yet her family was being destroyed by the influence of this leader. So what we're seeing now with ISIS, with Al-Qaeda, with Boko Haram to a large extent, and there was another group in Africa, the Lord's Resistance Army, the LRA, that also would indoctrinate and turn its adherents into killers and then release them. So this is what we're seeing. We're seeing a destructive cult basically controlled by an authoritarian leader or an inner cadre of leaders, And then we're seeing a process of coercive persuasion being used to break people down and change them, to clone the leader, to clone the mindset of the leader. And that is a killer mindset. And then ultimately to use these people like pawns, as suicide bombers, as murderers. And this is what we're seeing, a kind of mindless, without critical thinking, without individual autonomy, people who have given up, in large part, their ability to make their own value judgments, to think as individuals, and they've given that up for the mindset of a leader and leaders that control them.
I'm wondering how, in a world of so much social media and access to the internet, they can so effectively isolate their message and keep out the message of what perhaps, what is actually happening to women who end up in Syria and what their roles may be, the fact that they will not be educated, that many of them just become slaves or forced brides, and all the negative things that we have heard about people. How did they manage to segregate out, if somebody has access to all this social media and to the internet and to texting, to segregate out the messages that they don't want their targets to hear?
Well, this is covered again by the construct of thought reform. There is a kind of loaded language of thought-terminating cliches. The infidels, the crusaders, haram. They take words and then they redefine them according to the group's belief system, the leader's mindset, and then they use this verbiage to become essentially thought-stopping blocks against the flow of information into the mind of the people that they're recruiting. So they turn them against their own family. They turn them against their own community. They turn them against their fellow Muslims in the name of God or a sacred purpose or a sacred mission in that belief. But they basically begin to shut down the critical thinking of the people's minds that they are influencing. And when we're talking about these people, many times, if I were to say there's a common thread in the people that are recruited into extremist groups, that are recruited by destructive cults, it is that they are at a time in their life where they're feeling not so good about their circumstances. They're lonely, they're depressed, they're feeling marginalized. This certainly is the background of many of the people that we've heard about that have been recruited by ISIS in Europe, in the United States. And so at that vulnerable time, the group comes and says, look, we have the magic solution. We have the silver bullet that can cure you. You can become part of our community and be made whole again.
Well, let me just stop you there and ask you, because basically to me, listening as a parent, you've described most teenagers at some point some period during those teenage years where they feel marginalized and depressed and isolated. So the question then becomes, how much are we responsible as a society? And I suppose we could speak for America, or you could speak for the French or different places. This has now become a world or an international problem. How much are we responsible for allowing, I guess, in some respects, our youth to become targets of this death cult? And is there something that we've done that has made their job easier?
We haven't talked about all this. We haven't talked about destructive cults. We don't typically break down the stages of coercive persuasion or how does thought reform work. We use very generalized terms like brainwashing, but we don't go into detail and explain exactly how that works, what it looks like, what it feels like, so that when this process is being used on people, that they can identify it immediately and step back and say, wait a minute, I know what you're trying to pull on me here. I understand. And I think this is where a knowledge of destructive cults, their dynamics, how they work, and how they get people to become pawns is very meaningful. First of all, it's meaningful for us to educate the public, to educate young people, and to make this information as accessible and as understandable as we possibly can. That's what I've tried to do in my book, and that's the purpose of the Cult Education Database. The next thing we can do is that when people are coming out of that extremist milieu, and there are people that are coming back from Raqqa, that are coming back from these training camps, some of them running away, some of them taking a break, maybe even considering some type of terrorist activity in their home country. I think then we can use the tools of explaining coercive persuasion, of understanding how the programming of the extremist mind works in order to unravel it, in order to help people who have escaped sort it out when they are confused, in order to help people who are interrogating terrorists, to give them a little bit more of a set of tools to work with in that interrogation and debriefing process so that they can get that terrorist to divulge more information, to understand how they have been manipulated, and to be freed through that.
In fact, if anything, it seems as if during some of these interrogations that the would-be terrorist has manipulated the police officers into believing that they don't subscribe to any kind of terrorist philosophy and they're not a member of ISIS. We've heard of people being brought in and then released because they professed in obviously a convincing way that they weren't interested in becoming radicalized or a member of ISIS. My next question is, and I think it's something probably that a lot of the viewers wonder about, is politics and the behavior, the continued military bombing of Syria, the war that happened in Iraq. And I wonder if we hadn't engaged in this kind of behavior, have we created this death cult, or was the death cult inevitable? I mean, I think this is a question a lot of, it's a bit of politics. We're in a presidential season here in the United States. But nonetheless, I'm curious about when we think of how to respond to attacks, terror attacks, what are we just making matters worse and providing the death cult with more ammunition to use, or is this the only response that we can that is really available to us?
Well, Allison, the most horrific death cult in human history was Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Third Reich. And certainly Hitler came to power when Germany was at a very low point. I mean, they were desolate. They had suffered through World War I. They had given up territory. There were war reparations.
And they were humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. I mean, there was a lot of humiliation.
They were not only were they humiliated, the Deutschmark was, worthless.
Right.
And there was hyperinflation. And in that environment, Hitler was able to build his death cult by again, black and white thinking, labeling people as them, and then us, rationalizing genocide, and creating, just this climate of fear and hate that ultimately led us to World War II. I think that what we see in the Middle East today are people who largely feel disenfranchised. There are many people struggling to survive in poverty. There are the haves and there are the have-nots. And what ISIS feeds on, what al-Baghdadi, the leader, feeds on, is that despair, is that sense of there is no hope. What is our hope? And so in that sense, I really would put most of the blame not on the circumstances, not on history, but let's say that Hitler was responsible for the Third Reich, and al-Baghdadi is responsible for the creation of ISIS. The question is not how did we get here? As you pointed out, there are always young people who are going through difficult times. There are always world situations that are difficult that cult leaders can feed off of and manipulate for their own purposes. The question is, how can we get out of this? And I think the answer is, in part, understanding this doomsday cult mindset and understanding the techniques used by destructive cults to manipulate the minds of people. That's the component that I think has been missing in many of the debriefings of terrorists and the interventions that authorities have done. I mean, they have brought in moderate Muslim clerics to talk to them about why what they're doing is not true to Islam, which I think is very meaningful. But in addition to that, people need to understand, when they're in that situation with authorities, how they went from a relatively normal, moderate human being living in an open society to a terrorist operative, working at the behest of a madman, a dictator like al-Baghdadi. And I think that that process, understanding it, allows the individual to free themselves, if you will, from the machine, to unplug themselves and to think independently and freely again, and literally think their way out. And I think that's a very important thing to understand. How do they indoctrinate and manipulate and take over the minds of the people that are under the influence of ISIS? How does al-Baghdadi do that? How do they do that in the training camps? How do they do that in Raqqa? And how do they use the web and all of the social media to lure people through a kind of deceptive bait and switch process into their sphere of influence?
Yes, I think it's interesting because one would think we'd have progressed in terms of the psychology of people belonging to cults, and yet there isn't much of this type of discussion, except for that we're behind in our Twitter use, and they're using social media very effectively. But I don't think I have heard what you're saying, which is that private one-on-one with whoever is being targeted behind closed doors, that they don't necessarily need to be in Raqqa, that they certainly could be in their bedroom in Indiana or wherever, in some state. That sort of just springs to mind, given Indiana's latest refusal to let in any Syrian refugees. What I wanted to ask you is that there have been others who have come forward to give descriptions of what constitutes a death cult description. And I wanted you to maybe, if you could, give me your reaction to this. Author David Price Jones extended the death cult description to Islamics throughout the Arab world, saying Islamic fanaticism and the need to wipe out perceived shame merge into a socio-religious frame of mind that sends these young men happily to their gruesome but devotional deaths. They have become priests of killing. Do you agree with that description?
No, I do not. And I would say that we need to step back and we need to look at Jim Jones. Does he represent Christianity? Did David Koresh represent the Seventh-day Adventist movement? Absolutely not. These were deeply disturbed individuals, often described as psychopaths, who used religion as a device, as a tool to get power, to aggrandize themselves, and they were narcissistic, megalomaniacs who created these groups around them. And in the same way, al-Baghdadi and Osama bin Laden created ISIS and created Al-Qaeda. So if we need to stop trying to play the blame and shame game with Muslims around the world. I mean, I've traveled through Indonesia and seen a Muslim nation with 150 million people living in peace. And I think that rather than looking at the radical fringe of Islam, which is not always violent, any more than our own Christian fundamentalists in the United States, who can be quite outspoken and quite emphatic, they're not necessarily going out and blowing themselves up or shooting people.
Well, do we do a disservice if we call the members of ISIS Islamic terrorists or Islamic Yes, I mean, there's been quite a debate about how we should refer to ISIS. And where is the language the most effective in order not to assist in their campaign, the death cult's campaign to recruit?
Well, I again would turn the table on the critics that insist upon Islamic terrorists. And I would say, well, I have dealt with some very radical fringe anti-abortion groups. There have been anti-abortionists who have killed in the name of their cause, which kind of turns it pro-life on its head. But does that represent the vast majority of anti-abortion people who are very religious and devout, who have strong convictions, but don't go shooting doctors and blowing up clinics? So I think we need to call a spade and be very specific about what we're talking about. We're talking about destructive cults, and we're talking about death cults, doomsday cults, apocalyptic cults, led by absolute totalitarian leaders. And whether those leaders come from and use an Islamic frame of reference, or they use a Christian frame of reference, or a Jewish frame of reference, or a Buddhist frame of reference, which is largely what Shoko Asahara came from when he released sarin gas on the Tokyo subway system, that is not an indictment of that religion. It is an indictment of that leader and that leader's system of control and domination in that leader's specific sect or cult.
So frankly, we've seen ISIS successfully, for the most part, co-opt Muslims, the term Islamic, and co-opt it as part of their death cult. And many of us play into that attempt to take over that religion and fear it. And now it has become one and the same. And that's something that you're saying we need to be very cautious about doing and actually refrain from doing, because they don't represent Islam any more than these other horrific sociopathic leaders from other death cults who use religion as a means to recruit.
Absolutely, Allison. That's exactly what I'm saying. And the Pew Research poll that came out just the other day indicated that in many predominantly Muslim nations, the majority of Muslims do not agree with nor do they like ISIS. And they have responded to polling, and the research is there. It's available. I mean, they no more represent ISIS, no more represents Islam than somehow Jim Jones represented Christianity. But if you would ask Jim Jones when he was alive, before he influenced and manipulated people to their doom, almost 1,000 people, over 200 children in 1978, he would say, listen, I am a Christian preacher preaching the word of God. Everything that comes from my mouth comes from the Lord. If you disagree with me, you disagree with Jesus Christ. If you disagree with me, you disagree with his holy word, the Bible. So this is not new. It's not new that a destructive cult leader poses behind the facade or the mask of religion to rationalize and justify whatever they do, and to use as a lure, a bait, if you will, to recruit people. That's exactly what ISIS is doing. They're saying, we're the true Islam. We're the pure Islam. In fact, don't listen to Al-Qaeda. They're impure. Yes, they're right. Bad. I mean, these groups are so exclusive and so tightly wound around their leader and defined by their leader and their leader's mindset, which is being cloned through the indoctrination process within the group, in its training camps, through its social media outreach, that they don't accept the validity of even another Muslim terrorist group that you would think, aren't they our ally? Are they helping us in the war against the infidels? No, it's our leader. Our group is the truth and the only truth.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there because we're out of time, but I appreciate what you're saying, and I want to reiterate this isn't something that's particularly new, and we need to keep all of that in mind. You also probably should get Rick Ross's book, The Cults Inside Out, How People Can Get In and Can Get Out. I think it's an important book to read, and especially if you have teens and people in, I guess, from 20s to 30s, or anyone that you think might be susceptible to this type of brainwashing and recruitment by this death cult. It's important to read that, but certainly there are other cults that we've talked about before in the program. You can always look back and see my other conversation with Rick about other cults and how they operate as well. Thank you so much for watching. I want to thank Rick for being here. I think it was an incredibly informational and educational session here on Media Mayhem. I look forward to hearing your thoughts, and we'll see you next time.